we go. Now we are recording. We're going to start with Mandy. Now, Mandy is the CEO and founder of Feroce Real Estate Advisors, where she advises companies on how to position their buildings and teams to succeed during times of disruption. And during her 20-year career running multi-billion-dollar real estate portfolios at many great real estate companies, she delivered results to investors by approaching change as a value creation opportunity. Something Mandy does a lot. She approaches most things as an opportunity to create value. And today at Feroce, as an ESG+R practitioner, Mandy works with clients to chart the path forward through the shifting landscape of commercial real estate, tech, and consumer demographics. Mandy is also our most recent 2021 Champion Award winner and was celebrated this time last week at the annual awards. And so I am now going to turn it over to Mandy, and I'll be spotlighting our speakers so that they appear larger in your screen so you all can track who's talking.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathy, for the kind introduction and acknowledgement. Very much appreciated. It's so nice to see all of you. And on behalf of Crew DC, thank you for joining us to talk about ESG+R and ESG+R in action specifically. We are so fortunate today to have Wendy and Hyon join us to share their expertise and their perspectives on what ESG+R looks like on the ground today in commercial real estate. So our plan for this conversation is to start with a brief primer on ESG+R, hear from Wendy and Hyon about how ESG+R shows up in their work with their clients, and spend some time diving in and then answering questions as well. As we go along, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Our team, Cecilia and Leslie, are going to help me with that. And then when we get later in the program as well, we'll just open it up for conversation, dialogue, and questions. So let's dive in. We'll start with introductions. I'll introduce Wendy. For those of you who don't know, Wendy Feldman Block, she brings extensive experience working on a broad range of transactions in the DC metro area and beyond. She's an award-winning commercial real estate executive. She serves as the executive managing director at Savills. Wendy is passionate about wellness. Check out her hashtag on LinkedIn, Wellness in the Workplace, Wellness with Wendy. And she was the first broker in the world to advise a client on achieving both a WELL and a LEED Platinum certification. She's actively sought for her knowledge on the role of wellness in the workplace, which is all the more critical in the future in our post-COVID-19 world. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you.
And Hyon Rah is a sustainability and resilience strategist and an educator focused on systems-based building, energy, and water management solutions. Through tailored technical, operational, and educational strategies, she helps real estate and renewable energy developers, owners, and investors set and meet their ESG targets. She's worked around the world navigating different disciplinary, cultural, and regulatory landscapes in 5 languages. She is the principal and founder of RAH Solutions, a Washington, D.C. based consultancy. Welcome, Hyon.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I will take us through ESG+R. What is it? Why are we talking about it? Who thinks about this? So when we talk about ESG+R, we are talking about sustainable investing, and this is capital S, sustainable investing, that applies the discipline of an ESG+R framework to achieve strong adjusted risk returns and positive societal impact. You must have both strong risk-adjusted returns and the positive societal impact. That meets the needs of today without compromising the future. So there are 4 pillars in ESG+R. They're all interconnected. environmental, social, governance, and resilience. So environmental is how a company or a building is a steward of nature. Social examines how that organization, that building, manages relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities where it operates. Governance deals with the board, the leadership, the executive pay, audits, internal controls, and shareholder rights. And resilience looks at how properties, businesses are prepared to address risk. This includes weather-related events, global pandemics, business and market risks. And I give credit to Maureen, Joyce, and the team at AEW for bringing the R, the resilience, to the conversation. So ESG+R at its core is about creating long-term value through managing risk, building resiliency, and providing transparency and accountability. These are a set of standards, the E, S, the G, and the R, interconnected, that an investor, a company, a lender, a customer will use to screen potential investments and decisions. So sometimes it's helpful to think about a broad definition of an investment. And let's define that as a decision that involves money or something of value. So for today's case, we'll talk about an office tenant who's deciding on where to lease space. We can talk about a renter deciding on which apartment building to live in. We can also talk about it in context of your teenager deciding which product or brand to buy as a birthday present for a friend. We can look at it from a hospital or a university system deciding which vendors to choose for linens or food or landscaping. We can talk about it about which city, state, or country your family decides to visit for their vacation. Each of these are decisions where ESG+R criteria can play a role. So let's talk about the money and talk about whose money is being invested. So when we think of the money, think of your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles' retirements, their 401ks, their pensions. Think of your own retirement accounts. Portfolio diversification theory allocates money across stock, bonds, cash, and real estate. A pension fund or your investment advisement company makes those allocations across the asset classes on behalf of the beneficiaries, the people who give them money to invest. So what is the real estate? That is the real estate investment slice of this diversification pie. So we'll take an example of a building. Who owns this building? Does anybody recognize it? Anyone want to chime in because they know it? Okay. This building is owned by Oxford Properties Group, Crew DC members and sponsors, by the way. So when we say that a building is owned by Oxford, who really owns that building? Who are the beneficiaries? In this case, it's OMERS pensioners, the retirees, the dependents of Ontario Municipal Employee Retirement System is who Oxford manages money on behalf of. So people who worked for the Ontario Municipal System owned this building. So another perspective to take on the money is the capital stack. So capital sources, equity, and debt. This building is owned by Oxford. They have the equity in this building. It also might have debt, I don't know, but it might, either for construction or long-term debt. We all know lots of lenders who could hold the note for this building. So let's take MetLife purely as an example for a lender on a building like this and ask who are the beneficiaries, who are the money, who benefits from the interest that MetLife collects on a loan on a building like this. The people who buy their life insurance policies, the people who give them money to invest on their behalf, both individuals with retirement plans and institutions. All of this to show that the big asset managers, the investors, the investment management companies who invest in real estate, the MetLifes, the Oxfords, the BlackRocks, the Brookfields, the Nuveens, they are all investing OPM, other people's money. They're investing money on behalf of people's retirement and investment accounts. And yes, all of these managers, investment advisors, have ESG+R mandates. So that leads us to the why are we talking about it now? We'll start and look at it from two sides of the ledger. The first is the carrot. So we're going to follow the money. Money is the carrot in this case. So ESG+R is now a topic in the boardroom of institutional investors and corporations. It is on the agenda. And over the last 2 years, it's gone from a question somewhere on the list or on the agenda to now being a gating question. It's how you get in the door. It's a need to have, no longer a nice to have. So many people first heard of ESG with BlackRock's ESG integration statement in 2018 that they applied to their $8.6 trillion investment portfolio. Today, we see with GRESB, the global standard for real estate assessment, as of October this year, they have 1,520 participants in their benchmark, which is up almost a quarter from last year. And this represents $5.7 trillion across 117,000 assets. And another way to consider the money, the carrot, is the UNPRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. This is the world's leading proponent of responsible investment. It encourages investors and asset owners to use responsible investment to enhance returns and better manage risks. As of this quarter, they have almost 4,400 signatories that represents 121 trillion in assets. The number of signatories to the PRI, by the way, has almost doubled in the last 2 years. So this is one piece of the why are we talking about ESG+R. That's because this is the cross-section of the audience, the pool of investors, the pool of tenants, and the pool of partners that represent trillions of dollars in real estate. So let's look at the other side of the ledger, the stick side of the ledger, and we'll focus today on regulation around carbon caps. So as many of you know, and we are learning, the built environment contributes almost 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. And in the US, it has been cities and counties, who are driving the bus to meet climate goals through legislation on capping carbon. So two high-profile examples. New York City's Local Law 97, it places carbon caps on almost all buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet. That is a population in New York City of 50,000 residential and commercial properties. In DC, we have DC BEPS, the Building Energy Performance Standards Program. And these standards were created to drive energy performance in existing buildings that are 10,000 square feet or larger. In the commercial context, 10,000 square feet is pretty small. So it is a large population of buildings. And under these two and most local regulation around carbon caps, buildings must comply with the standards, the reduction of energy usage, or they pay financial penalties. In my perspective, the financial penalties are just the tip of the iceberg. Who is going to lease space in a non-compliant building? What do you think the interest rate will be for a loan on a non-compliant building? How low will the price go when you try to sell a non-compliant building? In New York today, you can walk around the city and just like restaurants that get grades for their health standard, you see a plaque or a piece of paper in a building lobby window that gives a grade on how they are performing for local law 97. Who wants to lease and walk into a building every day that has a D on the front lobby? It's going to be hard to lease. So let's not forget the humans who use our buildings. Stakeholders and consumers care. Remember that a real estate investment is successful if someone is willing to pay for it, either pay rent for it or buy it. And people are paying attention to how real estate is stopping being part of the problem and playing a role in being part of the solution. And forward-thinking real estate companies know that ESG+R is an important piece for their business. They know that in order to attract talent to their team, tenants to their buildings, customers to their spaces, and remember the carrot, continue to raise capital from investors and lenders, they need to articulate how they are contributing positively to the overall society at a global level, as well as how they're meeting the needs of the human at the individual level. So ESG+R is here to stay. It's real. If you find yourself or your team in the denial phase, be prepared, as you'll not be able to stay there too much longer. And for those who are experience avoidance as a motivation, I invite you to look at ROI from two perspectives that can help translate this change that the ESG+R framework brings into a value creation proposition. So yes, we have the traditional financial ROI lens of a return on investment that identifies the financial benefits. It's a math calc. But we also have a relevance assessment ROI lens, and that's the risk of ignoring, which helps us see what our risk of being left behind is. So I encourage you to keep your eye on the horizon. If you're not looking at the horizon while keeping an eye on your rearview mirror, you get left behind. And no one likes to get left behind. Not you, not me, not investors, not companies, because in the wild, being left behind means that you get eaten by the bear or the lion that is chasing you. So for commercial real estate, watching the horizon means understanding your user, your customer, your client, and what is impacting them. And today, ESG+R is impacting them. So with that, I will invite our panelists to talk about how they have seen ESG+R applied. And I'm going to stop my share, how they have seen ESG+R applied and working in today's marketplace. So we will start with Wendy.
Great. Thank you, Mandy. And I must say, I loved your discussion about being eaten by the bear. Not everyone on the phone call may know that you're from Alaska.
We do actually think about bears.
So I'm going to chat for a minute before I pull up my screen, because I think it's always nice to see faces. And I want to also just start by, I do need to give you a shout out, Mandy, because you have been driving this discussion more than anybody else. And when I had an opportunity earlier in the year for a tenant requirement, and they wanted to talk about ESG, you're like one of the first calls I made, because it's sort of like what I feel about where I was with wellness in 2016 all the way through 18, 19, and 20, where people still just kind of look at you and kind of glaze over. We're making progress on the wellness front, but we're still not there, and we have a long way to go on ESG. And I will tell you from my perspective as an occupier advisor, kind of furthering what you were talking about in terms of the attention it's getting, it is increasing at such a fast rate. And it is something that all of us need to understand at some level. And so it's a new thing in the brokerage world. I will tell you, I know that some of the really big firms have been doing it a little bit for a while, but it's not been discussed. So today I'm going to show you a few slides just at a high level, but know that this is an evolving process, and I'm actually helping to drive the charge on the brokerage front within my company to help educate people and let them know, which are my two favorite things. What's it about and why should you care? So with that, I will do my best to share the screen. And can you all see it? Great. There we go. So what I'm most excited about is something that my company globally has created called Savills Earth. And we are working very closely with our compatriots in the UK who are at the forefront, who are typically much further ahead than most of us in the US. So I wanted just to point out a few things to you. And this is sort of a very simple slide that follows on what Mandy was talking about. But what I wanted to say is, you know, why does it matter for tenants? And tenants are doing long-term leases for the most part, and they're partnering with this landlord. And this sort of stuff matters. We are in a period of enormous upheaval at so many levels. And one of the things that's causing upheaval is the fact that there's this great resignation going on. And tenants are trying to get their employees to come back to the office. They're trying to keep the employees that they have from leaving the firm or the company, and they're trying to recruit. So what really matters the most from my perspective, all of these are very important, but thinking about it through my real estate lens and advising companies in terms of the environment, looking at the waste and pollution and climate change are things that really come to the forefront as they are going after their efforts to keep engaged with those next generations of Gen Zs and others. That's important. Social, the working conditions and health and safety, and that's where some of the wellness falls under it, in specifically things like the well rating, and then of course everything related to governance. And so our Savills Earth team put this chart together, and to me, what's the big takeaway here is there's a lot of things going on in ESG, and so you want to really make sure that you partner up with people that understand it, people like Mandy, but also, you know, what it's all about. I've been looking at NAREIT, which looks at all of the REITs, and the amount of companies who are in the real estate sector that are reporting on their ESG has increased dramatically. And now more and more of them are starting to prepare ESG actual reports that they're putting out, which is a relatively new thing, even though ESG isn't. And there are literally, actually, I wrote it down. There are over 41 KPIs that can be looked at and 735 ESG questions and metrics. And so one might say, kind of, I'll get a little bit deeper in it. What's it about and why should you care? Because tenants are asking their landlords about this, and their employees are asking the tenants about it. And their clients are asking the tenants, what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? And part of it's the building. So in addition to ESG+R, we also do an ESG+H. And to me, the H is the health piece of it. And so I think it's really important to be thinking about that. And one of the things with regards to my burgeoning understanding of ESG is the fact that it's not like LEED, where if you go and you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to get a certain score. It's a lot more subjective. There's a lot more data points out there. And if a tenant goes to a building that has achieved a well rating or does it for their own space, they are reporting an ESG, it affords them more opportunities to improve their score, which is sort of counterintuitive to the way we think usually higher is better. Here, lower is better. And then I wanted just to share a few things that we're doing at Savills in terms of looking at the organizational sustainability and different ways that we are helping companies look at setting their strategies, doing their disclosure reporting and data, as well as implementing it. And again, it all goes back to our Savills Earth platform. And then a little bit more about some of the other things that we're doing with regards to infrastructure, zero carbon and low energy, utilities management, and all sorts of things related to partnerships on waste and circular economy. So I'm going to stop my share there and just mention that this is something that I feel is going to be one of the most important things we're going to be talking about in 2022.
Thank you, Wendy. I agree with you, but I'm 100% biased. Okay, let's hear from Hyon about what you're seeing today and what we can expect.
Sure. So hello, everybody. While I try to share my screen here. My name is Hyon Rah, and I'm super excited to be here to discuss ESG+R, what that means for commercial real estate from a solution provider's perspective. So as Mandy mentioned, I'm a practitioner. I used to work on designing buildings, building systems, and devising flood risk management and water management solutions. And what I do now is to actually advise people that invest and actually plan these types of projects to take into consideration ESG, environment, social, and resilience factors, but also to take a step back and actually think about all these piecemeal aspects that they're putting into their properties, because there are a lot of, as both Mandy and Wendy have mentioned, all these things are connected. And so just taking that extra step to look at what it all involves could actually do a lot more for you without extra cost. So I'll start with some context. This was last month in the town of Sumas in Western Washington, my home state, where 10% of annual rainfall poured down in just 24 hours. It damaged 75% of the buildings in town. And as we've all heard, these types of extreme disasters are becoming the new normal, thanks to global warming, which in this case enabled the warmer atmosphere to hold more moisture, which got released all at once in the form of torrential rain. Climate scientists have warned that the only way for us to avoid the worst impacts of global warming, we are already experiencing the impacts, unfortunately, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2030, which is about 8 years from now. So we do not have that much time, but I hope that that's enough for us to do something. So both the frequency and severity of disasters have been steadily rising, as you can see here from NOAA. The average number of $1 billion plus disasters in the most recent 5 years between 2016 and 2020 is about 16 per year. That averages to be about $128 billion in annual damage. And that's more than double the average for the past 40 years, starting from 2080. So that's crazy. And if you look at the types of disasters that have happened, water-related disasters account for about 90% of them, ranging from droughts, wildfires, to severe storms and floods. Many of the exposed areas are waterfront, where, as we know, the highest value retail real estate markets are located. So on top of that, we also have some water quality and health issues, for example, from combined sewage overflow system, where sanitary sewage and stormwater get combined into one system. So during heavy rains, combined sewers often run out of room and kick the raw sewage into the open waterways. That's why you smell a little bit, the open waterways smell a little bit funny after rain. And that's still happening in over 270 cities in the United States. And they affect, although and a lot of them are over here in the Midwestern and upper northern states. And they actually affect the livelihoods, all their downstream neighborhoods, because water flows down and discharge into usually ocean. So the Gulf of Mexico, where they actually don't have such systems, are affected and their livelihoods suffer. That's also where a lot, 40% of US seafood comes from. So we might be consuming some of that, unfortunately. Then there are the concerns about potential life-threatening pollutants, such as PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, in our waterways. Many studies have linked PFAS to cancer and other serious illnesses, but currently they're not regulated by the EPA, leaving the regulation and control to people like us, unfortunately. So what can we do as commercial real estate professionals? I'm happy to say that there are a lot that we could do, actually. Buildings and construction account for about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, as Mandy mentioned. And this means that we actually have a lot of leverage as an industry as a whole to lead and to contribute to changing this course. Our three main areas are preparing our properties for the increasingly damaging disasters that might strike, while addressing the root cause, which is global warming, by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon. Strategies for water conservation and filtration could improve occupants' health and well-being while addressing the first two issues that we just mentioned. And again, as the other two panelists said, none of these could be achieved alone because they are all connected. We have a really great tool in ESG to use as a guide and to motivate the investor community who actually control the big picture, because money is what moves all these and accelerates all these movements. As you can see from this score breakdown, this is from GRESB. This is the most used ESG standards for commercial real estate. Performance of individual assets account for 70% of the overall score, and 30% is the fund management itself. So actually, there are a lot of tangible things that we could do or demand as commercial real estate professionals on a property level. And building a strategy around water presents an opportunity to target many of these things at once, from energy and water efficiency to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and waste, and also more robust tenant and community engagement, because again, these are tangible things that you can see and experience and learn about. One thing to quickly note is that ESG tools tend to focus on managing existing risks on the property. So if you're considering new developments or acquisitions, a good place to start before you jump into even the ESG framework is to have a sensible site selection criteria that considers climate change risks. So avoiding these red areas, if possible, basically, before you even get to ESG would save you a lot of grief and money and so on. An example of a property that adopted a multi-benefit integrated water strategy to tackle the three challenges that we just talked about is the Center for Sustainable Landscapes in Pittsburgh. This is part of the Phipps Conservatory and used to be a dilapidated brownfield, which is really hard to tell. Now it holds LEED and WELL Platinum and Living Building certifications. So just taking a quick look at, I'll try not to geek out too much, but the green building technologies and passive technologies and natural processes the center adopted, you can notice that they are in fact all connected and work in concert with each other to serve multiple purposes. So for example, the filtered water, rainwater is collected on site, and then it gets into to be used indoors for things like toilet flushing. Not potable, unfortunately, because EPA regulations, but they're working on that. And then the wastewater gets filtered through plant and sand-based filters on the site. It does not smell because it's subsurface, but it's all naturally treated on site and also recharge the groundwaters. The geothermal system heats and cools the building, and the green roof and the vegetation all around the site not only help with stormwater management, air quality, and cooling in the summer, it also provides outdoor spaces for the occupants to enjoy on the site. So it generates, also generates all its energy on site with the solar panels that you see here. And then there's also like a little vertical wind turbine. And with that, it makes the building zero carbon and self-sufficient, which is basically the definition of being resilient. So to recap, we already, I want to just reiterate the fact that we already have the know-how, technology, and resources to meet 3 goals of net zero carbon, climate adaptation, and improving the occupants' health and well-being, all in one go. And to reflect that on our ESG ratings, which is also important. What we need, I think, is the willpower and the urgency to act before it is too late. This famous author of The Little Prince once said that as for the future, it is not about predicting it, it's about making it possible. And I really believe that we can make it possible together. So thank you for listening, and I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Hyon. Excellent. Okay, so our goal is to talk about inaction. So Wendy, I want to hear from you on 2 fronts. So one, I shared with you and Hyon yesterday that Jane Fraser, she's the CEO of Citigroup. She said that going forward, a client's emissions and their climate plan will be an evaluation tool that Citigroup will use to determine who they'll work with and how they'll work in the future. So I framed that perspective in or use that as a framing for what are you seeing in the market today for ESGR?
Well, it's very interesting, Mandy. I'm excited to see the market catch up, but it's not there. I will give you an example that I think typifies it. I think locally of some top firms like the Brookfields and the Boston Properties that are at the forefront. And if people on the call aren't that familiar, they should Google like Boston Properties, ESG ratings, and see Sustainalytics is one of the third-party companies that reports on all this. And I think it gives you some good insights because it would show you, for example, that Boston Properties risk rating is 13.6, and that's considered very low. There's 5 levels of risk rating. There is negligible, low, medium, high, and severe. And I think it obviously depends on what industry you're in. Like if you're in insurance, it could be a lot higher because there's a lot more risk. But for someone like a Boston Properties, it's relatively low. And so it's counterintuitive, but you want the lowest score. But the reason I highlight this is they're not talking about this at all. And as I struggled over the last few years to get buildings to be focused on wellness and certifications, all of that was accelerated by COVID. And now more and more are starting to think about doing it at the enterprise level for their portfolios. I think we're going to start to see in the next year and going forward that buildings that do report on it are going to be thinking about that and how do they communicate that? How do they communicate that to their third-party brokers or their in-house brokers? And how do those people then communicate it to people like me so that when my clients say, Wendy, we want to know what buildings we're looking at are reporting on ESG, I have some of that information. So I think that's part of it, but also, Mandy, as you know well, public entities report on ESG, some private, but not all. So what we also have to do is figure out what is that vocabulary and what things should people care about if they're going to a building that's doing good things, but isn't reporting on ESG, so that my clients can then make an informed decision as to where they want to go. Because at this point, it's not moving the needle yet, but we're at the start of that. And then the other part of it is, how do those companies use that information for their own recruitment, retention, and the biggest thing that's keeping people up at night is how do they get their employees to want to come back to the building? And so to me, that's all part of it. And that's where also for me, wearing my wellness hat plays in, because wellness is absolutely a piece of it in the social aspect.
Interesting. Yep. Well, for better or for worse, the SEC is going to help. They didn't release it this month, but they'll release next month the reporting standards and measures for if you want to use ESG in your investment strategy or your fund. This will impact mutual funds and stocks a lot because, as you might expect, in the last 2 years, lots of organizations all of a sudden slapped ESG on their mutual funds. And now they're going to be measured in whether they can do that or not. The same will apply to both private and public real estate organizations who want to use sustainable or ESG in their investment materials. So as with many things in life, if we don't do it, regulation is going to help us do it. Okay, so the other thing I want to share is I was on a group conversation through Nexus, which is a smart buildings community, which is fantastic. I learn so much every time I participate in one of their discussions. And they're all digital smart buildings far along on the curve. And so the owners, the investors were catching up. And an observation that was made is that the industry is flailing around right now, trying to figure out what to do. Oh, this is what tenants want, we're going to do this. Oh, this is what employees want, we're going to do this. Oh, this is what investors want, we're going to do this. Oh, this is how we solve the problem. Oh, this is the tech I need to. There's so many efforts in trying. And I don't say that as a bad thing. That's a good thing. This is how we figure things out. You be agile, you fail fast, and you adapt rapidly. But we are in that chaotic feeling moment of, I need to do something. I don't quite know what it is yet. I'm going to try this. And to some people, practitioners or outsiders looking in at our industry, they see us flailing. I'm going to say we are trying and we are making progress. So that'll be my intro, Hyon, to my question for you, which is, what solutions or what are you seeing that's being implemented that improves the performance that meets the goals that are set for these buildings and for these investments?
Okay, so when you say goals, and actually Wendy mentioned this a little bit earlier, how the goals and standards are actually moving to becoming performance-based than prescriptive. And I think that's part of the reason why people seem like they don't maybe know what they're doing, because they're not told exactly what to do. But what they are told is, for example, net zero energy. That is something that's been net zero carbon, net zero water. These are the three things that I come across a lot. But again, what does that mean and how do you do it? And why, right? And part of it is that if you're in places where there is regulatory pressure, obviously you have to do it, like in DC or New York or Denver, which just passed their green building ordinances. And in other places, they just see the trend that if you don't do it now, when there are incentives and marketing opportunities, you're going to be forced to do it, and you won't have any kind of edge to what to do. I think the lowest hanging fruit definitely is energy efficiency, and it's not as political as renewable energy. So I see that being requested a lot. Again, you have to start with assessing what you have. And I think that's something that I see that's so fundamental and essential that is not being done. Because people come to you with, you hear certain solutions, certain technologies that work or have worked for other properties, but they might not work for you, your particular situation, right? And knowing what your particular issues are, what your assets are in your asset, not to sound, okay, that was not the best wording, but in your property, for example, is it water supply that you're going to be struggling with, or you are currently struggling with? Some places like Arizona, you have flooding and droughts at the same time. And so those types of issues, just being aware of that, although it seems so macro, it has very immediate property level impact. And then how do you then mitigate those risks? And how do you also meet the net zero goals that you're prescribed to do and carry out? I think on a property level, that there are, again, like the project that I just showed you, there are technologies, and a lot of them are actually really low tech. You don't need internet, you don't need sensors, and those things are helpful. But if you actually look at what's been done for thousands of years in the built environment to conserve water, to fortify your place from floods and other risks, to make sure that you can power everything that your building and your occupants and tenants require, to make sure that there are nice spaces for them to enjoy, the air quality is acceptable, water quality is good enough not to make everybody sick, and so on. All these should be assessed together, have a baseline, understand what it is that you have, what your goals actually are. If you don't have any goals, you don't know where you're going. That's also very important. So to close, not to ramble too much, I just think that just not trying to copy and have these sound bites and try to duplicate it in your particular situation might not work for you. The net zero solutions, again, as a performative goal, I think you could apply it in a portfolio scale, but then you have to go down to the details and actually assess every site and do that. And it might seem tedious, but there are a lot of commonalities that you could draw from different parts, and then you get a hang of it. And again, there are people that could help you. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a whole series of questions I want to ask of Wendy and Hyon, but are there any questions that anybody has that they want to raise their hand, like literally physically raise your hand and come off mute and ask, or put in the chat? Happy to make sure that we incorporate people's questions during our discussion. Okay. Wendy, I saw your question about, can we expect to see that publication of the results in, like we see in New York and DC? And the answer is yes. And I'm pretty sure that the buildings who do well will highly publicize it as they move through their process of how do you communicate what your goals and what you're achieving ESG are, definitely. And then the district, that information will be available through their reporting as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Mandy, it's Kathy. I asked a question in the chat, but I think I have a more succinct way to say it. It seems to me that the realities that we live in are going to create winners and losers. And we see today where the losers are going to be. They're going to be in places like Miami. So, and I say that because that's not part of anybody here's locally, immediate jurisdiction, I hope. But I don't see, is the money not going to Miami? Is the money just looking short term, like I can make 3 years worth of investment out of this work, so I'll get in for 3 years and then I'll get out? When do we actually start seeing the winners and losers because of some of this environmental stuff begin to appear?
So it's a good question. I'll share my perspective, and I know that Wendy and Hyon have one as well. So there's a couple things to think about there. Yes, there is the long-term perspective and the short-term perspective. Even though when buildings are purchased, we use a 10-year DCF, a discounted cash flow to value them. And even if you are a long-term holder, institutional owner, sovereign wealth investor, you don't traditionally invest in your buildings like you're going to be owning it for 20 years. Now, of course, that there are exceptions for organizations who do and see it differently. But if you have a 3 to 5 year hold, yes, you are anticipating that you won't be there for the problem. The flip side of that is you can't get flood insurance through the federal government in Florida. Now, the state of Florida has solved that because they will give it to you. If you pay for it, it's expensive. But getting property insurance, property risk insurance today, and we probably have, I'm certain we have experts on the call about this, in certain locations is very hard because of how the industry has experienced casualty and losses in property over the last number of years. And we saw some of that in Hyun's graph on the significant disasters. So just think about how can you insure your sticks and bricks walk-up apartments in the Southeast today. It's expensive. And what does that mean in 3 years and 5 years? But long-term investors are thinking about it. And again, remember the diversification theory, right? It's not always zero invested in your riskiest areas. It's underweighting investments in your riskiest areas. So if you did have 15% in your what's now considered a more risky investment, maybe you're down to 7% and 6%, and you work your way out of it. So the change will be both slow and the impacts will be significant when they do happen. Okay, Hyon or Wendy, what's your take on that?
I actually just read a recent study about flood insurance and so on. And one thing that stood out to me was that although it's not, I've certainly had clients that still want to develop and invest in Florida, including Southern Florida, but they are having a lot more trouble selling lower floor units and leasing lower floor units in Miami. And that's for practical reasons, because it's been flooding a lot all the time. Not even, it doesn't even require any rain for Miami to flood these days. And I think over time, hopefully sooner than later, developers and investors will realize that even if their timeline is just 3 to 5 years, if they cannot sell any units at all or lease any of their properties that they develop and build, they're going to have to find somewhere else to put the money, right? So I think that's one thing. Another thing, Miami in particular, I think is also complicated because a lot of exiles from Latin America settled there, right? So it's home away from home. I think it's very difficult to just cope with the fact that where you put down roots and where you've been for generations will disappear, especially when it's such a prosperous city and the money and development is still there. And this links a little bit into the planned retreat type discussions that policymakers are now having in areas where they're disaster prone. One piece, and I'm not sure, I don't really have an answer to this because I think it's so personal, but I think we should talk about a lot more is, it's not just about rounding up people and moving them because these are disastrous, vulnerable places, because this is their livelihoods, even, beyond the commercial real estate investment realm. And I think to figure out how to either replicate or develop or find some kind of accommodations where they could feel like they have a community again elsewhere, where it's safer, would be really important to make these kinds of ideas actually happen.
I guess, Mandy, to answer at a high level for you, people are still going to Florida. I mean, I've an enormous amount of press for one of our DC friends who's moved down there, Dave Bevert, and what they've done in Tampa. And granted, Tampa doesn't have necessarily the water issues typically that Miami does, but they still do. And they can be impacted by hurricanes from what little I know about that. But to me, that's an example of somebody who's been really thoughtful in how they've planned a mixed use development. And this will be, actually, wearing my wellness hat, the first certified enterprise level community. And so I think that sort of thinking, that if we're not hearing it right now, like you were saying, Hyon, we're going to hear more of that. And as more and more people have to report on ESG, and as companies think about where do they want to relocate, because there were a lot, particularly during COVID, that were moving to Florida for tax benefits. In the long run, will they still? And I think the jury's out. We're in a period of evolution on this, but it is evolving very quickly.
Thank you. Okay. Cecilia, are there more questions in the chat that we should cover?
We had one from Leslie Morrison, who asked, what do you think the future is for carbon regulation or carbon taxes in the US and globally? Do you see real estate investors anticipating that additional financial burden?
So I'm going to be happy to answer that from a valuation transition risk, but I'd love to hear from Hyon or Wendy first. You want me to go?
Yeah,
Yes.
I want you to go, because I have to believe that they should anticipate it.
Okay. So here's my take on it from an investor perspective. So if you invest overseas, or you're an investor or from overseas in Europe and elsewhere, you're already very familiar with this. It's already part of your experience in your investment portfolio. So when you take that mindset, hi Leslie, when you take that mindset, wherever you put your money in the world, you bring that lens to it. Now, if you don't have that dollar amount, you might not put it in your on your financial statement for that, but it's part of your underwriting. Mm-hmm. And the other way that I think about this is the R in ESG+R, the resilience, is about how does your building, your investment, your portfolio, your company address risks. And right now, because we are in, and how are we addressing climate change? How are we addressing the Great Resignation? How are we addressing all of these things, living through and with and forever in a pandemic? That brings transition risk. So think about it from this perspective. So you have an office building down on Farragut Square, and you have no flood risk, but maybe you have protest risk, and maybe you have this other risk or something that all the big investors who pay attention to ESG+R are including in their valuation underwriting. So in their 10-year DCF, and it's reflected in the cap rate, and it's reflected in the IRR. But you don't do that, right? So when you're underwriting your portfolio, you don't include that. So then when a third party looks at your portfolio and compares you across your peers, A, you might outperform for a little while, but B, when you don't anymore, that is a risk to them. So they don't want to put money with you when you don't pay attention to a risk that others are paying attention to. So that's the transition risk, the valuation risk that we're feeling right now as companies are saying, oh, this is a risk I know about. How are you applying it to your investments? And this is what big from a stock and a mutual fund perspective is when Morningstar gives you an ESG rating. What does that mean, right? What are you paying attention to? How are you being valued when risks are incorporated? And then comparing you to your peers. You want to be in that peer set because all the stock money is moving in that direction. And B, you want to be able to articulate what you're doing where you don't get the money, which for a lot of people is a really strong motivator. So does that make sense? Does that answer your question, Leslie?
Yeah, I liked Wendy's comment too. She said if they're not, that they should. No, but yeah, thank you for that response. Appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, from a practitioner's point of view, like carbon taxes and carbon offsets, basically you are still generating carbon. That's the premise, right? And then you are being penalized for it, or you're being incentivized not to generate as much. And when it comes to buildings, like we just talked about, there are ways not to generate carbon at all. And I feel like at least as a practitioner, like that is my focus, to make sure that you're not adding any more risks in terms of carbon and others to your portfolio. And it's not expensive, I swear. It just needs a little bit of thinking. You know, places like the EU, they have the sustainable financial disclosure reporting requirement kicking in 2022. It's going to come here soon, I'm sure. And there are international development companies like the one that Wendy is with, where I think they're going to start thinking about, you know, when they start doing that for one part of their portfolio, they're going to start doing that for the US portfolio, I'm sure of it.
We're working on that right now, actually.
There you go. So I just think that for me, it's especially given the time frame of 8 years that we have, for me, it's a wrong focus. I just don't know if we have the luxury of talking about these new instruments to discourage or encourage carbon when the answer really, and we have the solutions for it, is to get rid of it. And for new buildings, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I know I can see other questions in the chat, but I'm also seeing from my employer that supply chain issues are also causing us to make more sustainable, low carbon choices because that's what's available. And the price point of new manufactured product has actually met the price point of reclaimed or partially reclaimed products. So that's been a very interesting transition as well.
Yeah, the supply chain and logistics from ESG+R perspective, right? We see that hit all 4 of the pillars, right? Your supplier diversity metrics, your just access to supplies, how it gets delivered, what the impact of the delivery is, and do you have multiple suppliers? And are they diverse, both from a federally defined women-owned business, minority-owned business, veteran-owned business, and what is their capabilities and what does their system look like downstream? We talked about that 2 years ago in one way, very much a specific way. And now, having lived through the current logistics, supply chain, all sorts of code words for we can't get what we ordered, or we're trying to deliver our apartments or our houses to be sold, and we can't because we can't put a refrigerator in there, and that's the one thing we need before we can close that transaction, right? That all that is code for we have to figure out a different way to do it, and it's happening today. It's happening in real time. Okay. More questions in the chat?
Yes, we have a couple from Lita Lewis. And Lita, would you like to hop on or hop off mute, I guess, and explain or contribute a little bit, since you have several parts to your question?
I just keep coming up with with more of them. So I joined about 10 minutes late, so I'm sorry if any of these were covered, but our financing and incentives starting to be tied to health, or what I call handprint sustainability issues, as we've seen occur over time with footprint sustainability issues like carbon or your energy footprint, basically.
So tell me more about that. How do you define the incentives and the health? Is that wellness, or what does that mean?
So sustainability sort of has two major chunks at this point. One is the footprint. So if I'm talking about water, for example, it's how many gallons of water would you use per minute, or how much you consume in a fiscal year. When it comes to health, it's what's in the water, the health of your building system, the resilience of your building system, as it directly affects occupant health. And so there's many other similar things with lighting and all kinds of other metrics. So I've seen over time, for example, incentives to do more energy efficient windows or more energy efficient systems, and it's all performance in terms of sustainability has been tied to energy or materiality, sourcing, and life cycle analysis. But are we seeing the energy behind developing similar incentives? For example, in housing, great, we've got an energy efficient building, but if it's full of mold and asbestos, I'm not really sure what we just saved.
Okay, so I can answer that. I'll start off with a couple of perspectives, because I did cover this earlier in the presentation of, yes, there's both the carrot of here's what people want and here's how we're measuring you, and it's ESG+R. It's multiple KPIs, not just one. KPIs, key performance indicators, not just one on the E. But also, I would say that the one answer that a lot of people talk about in perspective is how things fit across E, S, G, and R. And so your employee health and your employee health insurance is a great example. So how do you measure health? How do you measure the cost of not being healthy? And then I'll frame it in the context of a green premium, which Wendy and I have been talking about. When you think about selling a home, anything that you can actually label, and it might just be greenwashing, but also identify as actually better performing for the sale of a home is material, and you get better pricing. Same thing happens in commercial buildings, by the way. You can get a reduction on your debt expense of a couple basis points, up to 50 basis points, because you qualify for a green bond or some sort of green financing. And that is material, right? If you can save 15 basis points on your debt, that's money straight to the bottom line. As well as Cushman & Wakefield reported on their Green is Good report about how buildings that are ESG focused, defined sometimes by a LEED certification or others, both lease at better rates, lease faster, and they sell at better prices. So yes, the financing incentive is there. It doesn't have to be specifically, I'm going to give you a 15 basis point break on your debt. That does exist, but it also is, I'm just going to make more money for my investors if I make these decisions. I'd like to hear, Wendy, though, if you think about that from the wellness, the health perspective.
I believe at this point, it's still kind of new. And it's almost a little bit like the ESG. It's not that if you do all of these things that will guarantee that your score will be improved. But if you have enough data points, it can. And so we haven't seen a wholesale embrace until recently of some of these wellness standards, whether it's portfolio-wide, well health safety, or Fitwel Bio response. But I do think over time, you will see, to your point, Mandy, a better return if you have that. Because what it means is if you have those sorts of things and you communicate it properly, which is a whole nother discussion, you have a better chance of getting vacant space in your building leased, and hopefully at a higher return, a higher rent. Because at the end of the day, in general in our market in the DC area, and we're seeing it in most places across the country, there is a mismatch between supply and demand. There's a lot more supply than there is demand, and demand keeps getting pushed out because of COVID. And every time we think everyone's going to go back, most recently it was Labor Day, and now it's January, and now we have a new variant, it gets pushed out further, and the longer it gets pushed out, the harder it is to get people to get their employees back. And so then it's this whole circular thing where there's pressure on the landlords in how they communicate that. And I kind of joke that I have a side uncompensated business of talking to local owners and saying, what are you doing from a wellness front? And now I'm pivoting and saying, and what are you doing about ESG? Because, you can say when we talk, you and I talk a lot about this offline about, what kinds of green premium are people willing to pay for right now. I don't think we're there yet. I think that you will see a few one-off examples of buildings that can charge more because of that. But when you still have so much more supply, I think it's going to be hard to do.
Nice.
I think it comes down to again, resources are limited, time's limited, trying to do more than one thing with a one solution, right? So if it's just because your focus is in energy efficiency, it doesn't mean that that's the only thing your energy efficiency strategy will deliver. And as you might have noticed, I spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about water and existing buildings and historic buildings in particular. I think the connection between energy and other contributing factors, especially in scales beyond just the building scale, is really important for us to all know. And one thing, for example, is that, we are starting to, I think, branch out into just the building envelope and looking at inside of the building to looking at the different connections, because again, everything is connected. For example, when you have a house, let's say it's a house, or actually, let's say it's a big building and it requires a lot of energy. You have to pump a lot of water up the high rise, for example. That's an expense. If you reduce your water usage, you probably don't have to use as much energy inside the building. And what that would do on a bigger scale is that if you look at the source of the energy, a lot of the places, including DC, which is very far along in terms of renewable energy compared to other cities in the United States, we still rely a lot on fossil fuels for energy sources because it's centralized hydrothermal electric plants that generate with coal and natural gas and other things energy and then deliver it over to where you need it. So again, by reducing those kinds of demands, you are in a grander scheme reducing the need to produce as much energy using those undesirable sources. And then I have to also mention that for thermal electric facilities, that's actually where a lot of our water usage is at as a country, is to cool those facilities so that they can function. And besides the carbon argument of it, just from a straight water shortage and supply point of view, because a lot of places are actually running out of water, especially potable water that is drinkable. And one, you shouldn't be using valuable water for those purposes, which is one thing. And some places are starting to adopt that. But two, if you do not use those methods for producing energy, that reduces the water demands as well. So again, it's all connected. And we have to really start thinking about things not one-dimensionally, but in a really, really interrelated sense so that we can save time and money and do more.
I completely agree on the how can you do more with what you have, your resources, right? I call it second order benefits or third order benefits. How if you make this investment in this thing to solve this problem, it also can be used here and used here and meet goals as well as be part of your solution. And Wendy, you talked about communications in your side gig. I would love for you to share a little bit more about what you expect, what you're seeing today, which you shared a bit more, but what you expect to be coming both from the supply side of the equation and the demand side of the equation.
It's a great question, Mandy, about what we're going to see. And I will tell you that my journey on this, in adding ESG to my tool belt, was driven by a client. And they said it's an association. They're in the physics world, and they said, we want to know what buildings we're looking at are reporting on ESG. So that started me on my educational journey, and or as I like to say, into the rabbit hole of which I'm now living in, and trying to figure out, sort of like what I did with wellness back in 2016, where nobody knew what it was. Now, you'd have to be living under a rock if you're an owner to not understand what ESG is. But I still marvel at how none of them are thinking about that. So I think that the owners have to figure out, whether they report on it or not, that there are key metrics. And I'm incorporating it into my processes now. I'm using it as a filter to help identify what buildings I'm going to show people. Because let's just say I have a 20,000 square foot requirement downtown. There are more options than I know what to do with. And my client has hired me so that they don't have to have me give them every single thing. They may say, Wendy, what are the top 30 that we can then whittle down to? And even 30 is more than they want to see. So I'm going to put that lens on. And then when we go out and we do tours, we're going to keep whittling it down. When we do requests for proposals, I'm going to have an exhibit that I want them to fill out a form. And so I'm working to develop these tools so that I can have consistent data and look at it on an apples to apples basis as much as possible, recognizing that if you're Boston Properties or you're Brookfield, it's going to be a lot easier for me than if you're somebody that's not publicly traded and that's not putting out a lot of this information. But we want to help them make more informed decisions. Although, given how hard it is to get this data, it's not like it's in CoStar. Like CoStar now reports on whether something is Energy Star or LEED. They're not reporting on any of these wellness things. I've asked. And I don't think they're going to be reporting on the ESGs. So it's incumbent upon me, my people, our research department to do this. I can't do that when I'm at 30 buildings. I can only do that when I whittle it down. And again, there are more kind of data points for them to help make informed decisions. And then it's also up to the client on how they use that information for their employees and how they use that as a tool for recruitment and retention.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about comms communications. I was fortunate to listen to a guest speaker this morning, Mike Burns of Burns Brothers, who's a communications expert. And one of the things that our group talked about was when there is no communication, someone's going to fill in the gap, right? They'll either do it for you or they'll, the stories we tell ourselves in our head type thing. And in the ESG world, social responsibility, investing world, there are firms that scrape the internet for information about investments and funds and companies that don't actually publish anything, but they will scrape everything you do and give you a rating. And you have as the firm, you have no control over this. So you get rated by somebody and it doesn't always feel good. And so then you're reacting to that rating, which someone labeled you with. So get ahead of it is what I hear from you. And the client that I say.
I will say one other thing that I found really interesting, and when I read about it with what you shared with regards to Citibank, I don't think landlords are in a position at this juncture, or will be in my career, where they're going to say, you know what, we don't want that tenant, to come and lease 100,000 feet in our building, okay? But I do think what I find refreshing is, because we're still in a period of discovery, companies are and how they deal with this ESG is, and it sort of goes to your point, like figure out what you need to do it. You may make a mistake, but then fix it. And it's okay because we are in this period. Now, down the road, you better not be making those mistakes, but we're still in a period of discovery. And I think that that's a really important takeaway.
Wendy, I'm glad you said that. I was just thinking as you were all talking about the lack of consistent, available information for all of these people on the owner side, on the decision maker occupier side, on the user side, the employee side, to make the decision. I mean, it's hard work to figure it out. And ultimately, even places like New York and DC that have implemented programs around some data points that they want to collect, compliance and accuracy and availability of that data is of concern. But it's an imperfect process. So it takes time to put it together.
And I will mention one of the things, and Mandy's aware of it, is called measurable. And measurable is there's all these amazing prop techs out there. And that's one of the products that companies can use to report on ESG, because it's not easy and people are still trying to figure it out and will be for some time.
Mm-hmm. It's true. So from a prop tech perspective, Hyon, that makes me think of you on the solution side and technology as a tool. What are you seeing and what should we be expecting?
I mean, on the built environment side, a lot of sensors, controls, building integration systems, right? That could actually measure and generate data for you and then feed it into systems like the Measurable and GRESP and others that you just talked about, so you don't have to do it manually. So those are really useful. Other things, I think one thing that I've noticed lately that's not maybe as techy as before is just the user interface change that I've seen. It's becoming a lot more graphic and a lot more, I think the target used to be engineers and very technical people before, that you see a device or see a technology and then you have no idea how to use it and what it's for. And now I find that as more things become integrated into one interface as well, there are a lot of visual and graphic interfaces that are just better for communicating and understanding for non-experts. For example, instead of having to read out numbers like kilowatt hour that maybe doesn't make sense to you, it has diagrams of houses or something that actually makes sense. So this is going to power this many, I don't know, hair dryers. I'm not sure, things like that. So I think communication and having the technology actually be the bridge to make sense out of the numbers, that all these measurements and numbers that we have has been immensely helpful. And I think that's something that I've been very happy with lately. As for just investing in random technologies, I think there are places for specified and unique technical options that you can employ in specific situations. But again, it's really important that you are sure that that is what you need and that there are no other options that might be cheaper or easier or might even engage, from a supply chain and local community perspective. Maybe there are things that you can leverage local knowledge and labor, for example, instead of having to ship something over from abroad that you press a button, which might take quite some time these days. So I think there are just, it's good, but I think you have to know what to use, when to use it, how to use it, and be very mindful of that to make sure, again, time and resources are scarce.
Hyon, you mentioned about kind of the different ways of communicating it. I think that's probably the most important message for people who are advising owners and whatnot in the office sector, at least that I deal with, and that is they need to figure out how to very succinctly explain it. I'm a big fan of matrices, one-pagers, and figure out how to communicate that. And I always say you get one shot at your subject line when you're sending out emails to all the brokers, when there's so many emails I'm getting about properties. And if you can convey to them that what makes your building special and your ownership special because of what they're doing with things like ESG, and educate them, because for the foreseeable future, there needs to be a lot of educating.
Agreed. Okay. So as we wrap up, I want to see if we can have one more question. If anybody else has a question they want to come on camera or unmute and ask. And then I'm going to ask for, we started with what's your one word? It doesn't have to be one word, but what is your takeaway you want to share with the group, Wendy and Hyon? But before we do that, who has a question to pose? I'll give it time. I learned last year during my children's Zoom schooling, school on Zoom, that the teachers learned to give each kid 1 minute when they called on them to answer a question. And I was like, oh my gosh, 1 minute is so long. It's like 60 ticking seconds. That's what the teachers practiced.
Well, and while we're waiting on that, I'll give you my word as opposed to what I started with, and which was gratitude. And to me, it's also, I'm enthusiastic. I'm really enthusiastic about where we are in the US and globally, and progress we're making to tackle some of these huge problems that impact the climate, that impact our ability to do a better job of helping people come back to the world in sort of a post-pandemic way, and the role that we can all collectively play.
I would echo that sentiment, Wendy, especially on collective action. And again, everything is connected. I say this all the time. I think if you spend time with me, that's what I say. We are short on time, we're short on resources. There are solutions that we have that could address all these things at once. We just have to stay focused, and having ESG become, and resilience as well, obviously, become mainstream as it is starting to seem so, which I'm very happy about, is a complete game changer. And I think we are still at a point where this is a value added and a market competitiveness piece, rather than everybody has to do it. I think we are just at the cusp of it. So don't miss the chance. We can do it. We have the tools and knowledge, technology, resources. Let's do it.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to say adaptation. That's my word. From the context of we are actually in the middle of the adaptation moment, and that our industry has been, over the centuries and the decades, very good at adapting, and we will continue to be good at adapting. And when we see both an opportunity or a challenge or a problem, then we can adapt. And right now, from an ESG+R perspective, it's here, it's real. I encourage you to get in the adaptation mindset. Okay, cool. Anything else before we say thank you and move on with the rest of our day? Anybody?
Thank you, crew. Thank you,
Oh,
Mandy.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you to our programs team that put this together. You guys are brilliant people, and you make me want to hurry up so that we can fail fast, get better. And as Hyon says, get there, because we don't have that much time left. So. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for
Thank
showing up.
you.
I know we had lots of experts in the audience, so I appreciate that.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day. Bye now.